Is the afternoon session 4A on retail pricing, and it will be chaired by Paul Sotkiewicz. I hope I got your name right, Paul. Oh, thank you. Paul is a very shy, retiring, bashful guy. You know, he doesn't really like to say too much, but I kind of twisted his arm to get him to come chair this session this afternoon. So I'm hoping that he'll, come out of his shell and give us a good session here. I'm sure he will.
Wow, when you have an introduction like that, I don't think there's much else to say. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the retail pricing session. I think this actually dovetails well with some of the things that we've talked about earlier today with the zero marginal cost or the marginal cost session, zero emitting resources, and we got a little bit in the rate design here. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to kind of change the ordering around a little bit, so you'll have to be patient with us. I'm going to have Devin Hartman from the R Street Institute lead off, and Devin's going to talk about C&I, customer response, but also talk about the political economy of retail pricing and getting responses that can help us with reliability. And so starting off with that, and then we're going to transition to Sanem Sergici from the Brattle group. And Sanem's been working on rate design for, God, how many years now? 15 years, something like that? 20 years? Right when she came out of grad school and started working for Brattle. And she's got a wonderful summary of the different types of retail rate design options, how they dovetail with wholesale markets and system operations, and some great examples here. And then we're going to turn it over to Obadiah Bartholomy from SMUD. And many of you already know Obadiah. He's going to actually give us an example, really down in the trenches about what a lot of the utilities are having to deal with, what their experiences are, the problems they've run into. And then we're going to end this, and batting cleanup will be Carl Linvill from RAP. And Carl's going to talk about a new tariff design that kind of dovetails and brings it full circle with the session this morning on zero emitting resources and how we incentivize these through the rate design. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Devin. And Devin, the floor is yours. Everybody's got about 20 minutes. Hopefully we'll have about 25 minutes at the end for Q&A. So Devin, the floor is yours, young man.
Thank you. All right, here we go. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? A few yawns. Yeah, if you doze off, I won't be offended. I get it. The food was quite good at lunch, and in my experience, usually post-lunch conferences are more attentive the worse the food is. So I was actually kind of hoping that the food wasn't that great. But here we go. No, we'll dive right in here. Thanks for the warm welcome there, Paul. I just call him Dr. Paul because I can never pronounce his last name. So
You can call me.
Oh, there we go. That works.
That's my mother's maiden name.
As Paul mentioned, I'll dig into a little bit more of the C&I perspective, both some of the work that R Street's been doing, but also I used to be the head of ELCON, the National Industrial Energy Consumer Trade. So we'll give you a little bit of perspective from that old hat as well. For those of you that aren't familiar, R Street's a pragmatic free market think tank. We engage in regulatory spaces, legislative spaces, research community venues, both at the state and federal level. So to give you the quick overview of what we'll cover here today, first off, I'm going to talk about why I'm so excited that we actually have a retail panel. Everyone talks about wholesale, but retail is every bit as important. And then I'll get into some of the C&I-led reforms. There's a lot of interest in getting C&I direct market access to wholesale prices. We'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about like other mechanisms that are more indirect. And of course, the topic du jour, we'll put this in the load growth context. I do, in fact, have the answers to everyone's questions on AI load growth. In fact, I just asked AI to create an image of what AI energy demand looked like. And I got this. I don't know what this is, but just gaze into this, and I think we'll find an answer somewhere. Maybe it'll take a few drinks into the cocktail hour for something, though. And then we'll package it all up with, I think, some research priorities, because I know we have a lot of the research community in the room here. So we'll leave off with some of the implications therein. So first off, why I'm so excited about retail. One is RTOs are not enough. So much of the conversation is very fixated on whether a state is in an RTO, and then if they're in an RTO, just get the market design right and our problems are solved. Those are very important components, but left on by themselves, it's not going to solve the economic efficiency and reliability problems and the decarbonization objectives. You really need to make sure that recognize that the market composition matters every bit as much as the market rules or design. And so for that, that's where retail competition comes in, because that's really what's going to help determine the composition of that marketplace. I think we've seen a lot of this recognition a little bit more on the supply side. Think about how a lot of merchant generators have performed relative to cost of service generators within the same market. So you can control all those variables. We've started to see pretty pronounced behavioral differences and more efficient behavior from the merchant model. So I think that's starting to get some recognition. But what's a bit underappreciated, I think, is on who's actually the demand side. How does the demand side of the equation look here? One of the important things is in footprints like a MISO or SPP, it's important to keep in mind this is primarily comprised of geographic monopsonies. And so if the folks buying on the wholesale market are under cost of service and they're the serving captive load, you're going to see a very different dynamic than either a competitive retail provider interfacing with end users, or in the case of large C&I, those who actually, some of them are just directly plugged into the wholesale themselves with no intermediary. So the retail component is really important. So to help kind of folks overcome sort of like the sort of just the false binary of RTO status and really think about the retail piece and the wholesale retail combination, we did a paper last year. There's a link to it. You can check out the paper on that at another point. But it's really important, I think, to recognize, at the risk of way oversimplifying it, there's sort of like three architectures out there. One is you still have the traditional model, so traditional cost of service, no RTO. And then you have fully restructured, right, RTO with retail competition, so markets that are almost entirely or mostly IPPs and competitive reps. But where actually most of the country either is or is heading is actually more of a hybrid model. And that's where you have RTOs with predominantly cost of service market participants to varying degrees. So it's a very big bin in the hybrid space, but I think it's worth making some distinguishing elements up front on that. And so as we look at the status kind of in the field, right, we all know wholesale markets have been expanding, but it's worth noting that retail markets are actually staying relatively stagnant in recent years. There's a big contrast between residential and C&I in recent years, and especially where the momentum is going forward. So I'll unpack that in a bit. And part of this is that we see C&I really becoming more impatient, especially in the load growth context with cost of service regulation. In some extreme cases now, you're even seeing service denials. So some data centers or crypto are actually not even able to secure service commensurate with their business operations. But some of this also just goes back to sort of turbocharging the original restructuring thesis, and that's that when consumers have choice in their supply arrangements, it helps them access competitive suppliers with superior terms of service. And we see consumers having much more diverse profiles than we have historically. And that's across a few dimensions. Some of it is risk tolerance. Some of it is different price sensitivities. The unreliability, the value of lost load is important to think about as a distribution, not a single estimate, and recognize that there's a huge variance in reliability valuation by consumer groups, and thus retail products can be customized to address that. And then the more novel recent thing is sort of like the green space. And we're seeing a lot of folks wanting to go, of course, just beyond a generic green tariff. There's a lot of like gradients of premium greens products out there. So you're seeing a lot of those preferences wanting to be exercised by business consumers, and thus they want more supply optionality. So to get you up to speed on a couple developments here, one is what we're seeing in hybrid and traditional states right now is a lot of the state C&I groups are typically have a particular preference or pecking order, if you will. Their preference tends to be just give us direct wholesale market access. That's usually numero uno. The big question is always, do they do it just for the CNI segment? Is it just a subset of CNI? Sometimes it's just a few large CNI and excluding other CNI. But a lot of times they have a single representative for the major CNI in a state, and that usually they kind of all go to bat together. And the big question is whether they're going to play ball with residential in some of these efforts. And that just varies by state. Now, of course, if they don't get direct wholesale market access, then you start going down the pecking order a bit more. And a lot of the A-list alternatives we see are things like, well, if we can't get direct market access, can we get sort of an indirect version, like indexed rates or a special commercial or special industrial rate? And they come in a lot of shapes and sizes. Sometimes a quick arrangement that's getting more attention now because of load growth constraints that you can implement quickly, like sleeve arrangements. And then sometimes there's third-party PPA arrangements that can take a little more time. And then you go further down the list and you get like, hey, if we're going to be captive load, we would at least want to have competitive procurement or some other type of special tariff tailored to our set of interests. And then I listed here roughly an order of interest the states that you see this. This is, I think, between those two bullets, I have 13 states. It's probably safe to say that the majority of traditional and hybrid states we're doing some type of work with a state CNI group on this. So it does constitute the majority of what remains sort of states under the traditional or hybrid paradigm. Louisiana is very interesting. We kind of spell this out in our paper, but I think that's an important kind of commonality across a lot of states right now. And then in the restructured states, it's important to note too that the only state that actually really implemented the restructuring blueprint, according to how a lot of economists laid it out, was Texas. Texas in particular did a good job of making sure the distribution utilities role was confined and then sort of contaminate some of the competitive supply space. A lot of other states have not done that to the same effectiveness. So there's a lot of that's back on the table to address that, making sure like things like default service is not being cross-subsidized and jacking up rates through kind of hidden means, and then undermining the competitive retail market. So you're seeing a lot of that pop up, but also what we're seeing in the load growth context quite recently here actually is that you're seeing a lot of concerns that we won't have enough new supply to meet reliability requirements. So we see more rent seeking a lot of times by some of the distribution utilities and really their parent companies to say like, well, let's get back in the generation game. So that kind of goes back in the opposite direction of what the blueprint for restructuring is. And we're actively seeing that pursued in Ohio and Pennsylvania actually as we speak. So these are all items on a lot of the state CNI groups wish lists. And then of course, a lot of this is turbocharged with load growth. And imagine you all have heard plenty about this right now, but just to narrow it down on the CNI perspective right now, a lot of the stuff is kind of bringing back up the issues that led to restructuring in the first place. We haven't seen much load growth in the restructuring era since markets really matured in their design and implementation. So what's motivating a lot of the CNI segments to start pushing for wholesale access is a lot of them are looking at typically utility IRPs or certificate of need cases and going, whoop, nope, overcapitalization and risk socialization bias is too much. We know we've talked to brokers or we know other third parties that can do it much cheaper and manage that risk profile better and get better terms of service. So that's where you're seeing a lot of this renewed interest coming back up. And then I just created this chart from some of the Brattle forecasts. But again, it is interesting to note that in the red bars there, how much of this is highly concentrated, how much of load growth is concentrated in the CNI segment. And where residential is starting to come in is that when you rate base assets to meet load growth, it tends to put upward pressure on rates across all rate classes because it tends to be rolled in depending on how you do cost allocation. It tends to actually affect residential quite substantially. So one of the areas where you see some negotiations now for CNI is saying, hey, we'll just take our new load and just put it through a competitive mechanism. Then residential and any remaining captive load doesn't have to worry about the rate effects of rate basing renewables with all this gas backup with, you know, an SMR or two thrown in, which has got a lot of the consumers nervous at the moment. So of course you might be thinking like, ah, well, if the economics are there, certainly you see a lot more reforms. This is where the political economy comes in, right, Paul? What we're seeing is a lot of times you have, you know, the classic case of an incumbent supplier that has a very concentrated interest, typically in that consolidated market. A lot of motivation to be very well represented in the political decision-making process, whereas the benefits of competition tend to be dispersed across consumer groups that are really face a collective action problem and being organized to the same extent. So that kind of explains why you don't tend to see as many reforms despite a strong willingness by the beneficiaries to see those reforms through. I think Virginia's an interesting case study. I've linked to a piece here if you want to read a little bit more of it, but that's an interesting example where some of the large loads in Virginia already have market access, but the rest of the C&I class does not. They've started to organize, and they've started to organize with environmental groups and sort of economic liberty oriented groups and a variety of different folks to kind of form broad coalitions. So I think the Virginia example is kind of an interesting case in point for where we see the frontier of a lot of these reforms being on the docket, but not many of them are not getting over the finish line yet. And so I think to pull this into a little bit more like the research-focused community's mindset on the prospective basis, I think if there's a few interesting trends that we're seeing that'll translate into some big unknowns and thus a lot of value add for the research community. One is that supply decisions are way more complex today than they've ever been historically. Just the technology choice component is a huge element. And then you also think about, again, load growth hasn't really happened very substantially in the restructured era. And the other piece is that it's not just the degree of load growth, but it's also the uncertainty associated with it. And the prediction intervals, right? And some of these forecasts going forward are huge. I just had to show some of the PJM sensitivities on just data centers alone here as an example that anytime you have more risk, the more you want properly motivated competitive suppliers to bear that risk. And so that's where I think you're going to see that the risk management mechanisms kicking back in here. And then, so I think there's a couple working hypotheses I think we're starting to see out in the field, and it'll be really interesting to see empirical work dig in further on this, but a couple working theses we have is sort of how does load growth work without retail competition, and how does it work with it, especially in the C&I segment again. And so right now, again, regardless of RTO status, honestly, if you have those wholesale signals getting through via retail competition, you would expect to see a few things. One, you expect to see, at least to a degree, more flexible operations of the new loads coming online, as well as the existing loads. You'd expect to see at least some degree of siting concerns like accounted for, things like congestion patterns, anticipated congestion patterns, I should say, reflected in a lot of the forward contracting, et cetera. That might affect siting decisions. Another piece that's interesting is the degree of self-supply options that are available to C&I now. Historically, they were really only kind of equipped to have CHP, but now there's so many options out there, and I see Mike Haggerty out there. So for those of you that attended Brattle's the presentation on thermal batteries, that's just one classification of resource where we've really seen a lot of the newer technologies create a ton of opportunities for self-supply, whether that's a true partial requirements customer orientation, or it's really more of a traditional customer arrangement, but with a lot of physical reliability hedging on site. There's just a fascinating gamut of preferences in C&I right now. And we've just seen those as well as demand side flexibility, which we've pretty much only seen in a lot of the retail competition footprints. So I think a couple of research priorities that are interesting to tee up. One, always encourage folks to think about doing economic efficiency as a function of these wholesale and retail architectures. Those combinations are really important. It hasn't really been framed or studied that well. That's why we wanted to do that paper last year, but the goal was to kind of get people to be inspired to do the next tranche of research after that, and kind of spin off all these mini theses and start doing more empirical work. It's really going to be impactful to do stuff that's prospective and state specific, because that's where most of the decision making is obviously happening. In fact, all of it on the retail side, of course. And then there's a couple other little nuggets to have in here. One is that's interesting right now is trying to tease out C&I's willingness to pay for a variety of considerations, premium reliability, or even like lower end reliability. But I think the premium stuff is interesting because that's where you get into that physical hedge interest on the self-supply, as well as looking at what their willingness to pay is for some of the green products out there. There's a lot of debate, of course, about I think the last panel that went right before lunch got into some of those financial product arrangements and how well those correlate to environmental outcomes. That a lot of the ways around that, of course, to have the most verifiable emissions avoidance is to have it in your own backyard or on site or nearby. So there is an interesting test bed. So I pulled a few of the headlines that you've seen recently to flesh out the right here. But there's an interesting implied valuation there that we should be exploring more. And then I also think when we talk about like the future of load growth here, the elasticity of short and long term load is going to be really fascinating, I think. The long run stuff, typically elasticity has been more pronounced in the long run, was my read on the literature. But and I think that there's going to be some renewed interest in that with siting considerations. But back in the short run, this matters again for new load as well as existing load, which perhaps brings me to my final slide here. And that's that I really think it's going to be fascinating to see if we're at the precipice of being able to unlock flexible demand. As mentioned, we've really only seen much either economic demand response, not emergency demand response, economic demand response in areas with retail competition. And in areas like ERCOT, where you do have a very robust market design for this, I think there's a really interesting research question here to say, wait, if wholesale prices are rising to this level, thousands of dollars per megawatt hour, why don't we see more curtailment of load that is hundreds of dollars per megawatt hour? A lot of that boils down to transactions costs and information asymmetries, and that gets you into some aspects of market design and how well C&I's flexibility characteristics, for example, as a function of lead time play out. But those are some of the things where I think ERCOT is a fascinating test bed, and then some of the Eastern RTOs will have some opportunities to do that. And the last note I'll leave you with here is that while FERC winds down some of its transmission conversations with NARUC, they're looking for a new topic. They're really interested in unlocking flexible demand. But in feedback from staff and commissioners, what do they say? How much of this is in our hands? Because you need competitive retail to make this work. So I do think that there's an interesting element of the wholesale leaders and the retail leaders coming together, especially to start talking about unlocking flexible demand. Thanks.
Thanks, Devin. If you could go ahead and get Sanem mic'd up here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up the next slide. Now, you'll obviously see that we have switched things around, so I'm having to make sure that we get everything teed up properly. And there's Sanem's. There we go. Very good. So we'll turn it over to Sanem, and she's going to talk about the different rate designs. And I think it's interesting. I think most of what we're going to see in her presentation is really related to, the regulated side mostly. But again, when you have customer choice, as Devin's talking about, then it opens up a lot more combinations than what even she's going to talk about. So Sanem, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to be talking about one of my favorite subjects. As Paul mentioned, I've been trying to figure out how to move retail pricing forward over the past couple of decades. And we've made progress, but we definitely need to make more progress, especially with the energy transition that we are going through right now. Pricing will definitely play a big role. So for the longest time, and still today in many jurisdictions, the rates for residential customers mostly, and also for small C&I customers, they have two parts. One part is a fixed monthly charge, and the other part is a flat volumetric charge that is basically static across the course of the month and the year. There are variations in some jurisdictions. There's inclining block rates, declining block rates, but in many jurisdictions, what's really missing is the temporal variation in the pricing, because that's how the generation changes, depending on the time and the location of the generation. We have prices changing, but that has not been reflected in retail pricing to a large extent. And I'm not talking about some of the large C&I customers, but mainly focused on residential and small C&I customers. Residential rate design is really ripe for change, mainly because historically, the load kept growing. There was just this whole load increase, and it slowed down for a while. Now it's increasing again, but the whole construct of moving all the fixed costs to volumetric usage and expecting that with increasing consumption, you will be able to recover those is not working for the residential class as a whole, because residential customers are investing in solar PVs, and they're doing a lot more energy efficiency. So this creates this cost shifting and a revenue collection for the utilities. But also, rate design is ripe for change because we need a lot more load flexibility in the system. Again, for the longest time, supply followed load, but now we are in this world where load needs to follow supply because supply is intermittent. And there are actually various alternatives to standard rates that I just mentioned, those two-part volumetric static rates. And many of these rates are enabled by advanced metering infrastructure. Again, previously we had these legacy meters. They couldn't meter on an hourly 15 minutes intervals, but in many jurisdictions now, and in fact, I think the latest status, 85% of US residential households have smart meters. One of the most important barriers before time varying pricing has been lifted. So practically, we can and we should be able to pursue some of these alternative rates. And we have a fairly long list here. The standard one, or the most sort of initial basic one, is the time of use rate. This is not necessarily a dynamic rate, but it's a time varying rate. Here, the rates are higher for a given residential customers during the peak period when it costs higher to produce electricity, and they are lower during the off-peak periods where it doesn't cost as much to produce electricity. And essentially, this rate structure stays with the customer throughout the year. They know what they are managing to, and they're able to shift load from high cost periods to low cost periods, or high excess renewable generation periods to low renewable generation periods. So there are different flavors of this. And then there are these dynamic versions of time varying rates, like critical peak pricing, where during a number of days in a given year, let's say 20 days, where the grid is experiencing a lot of stress, you call it an event day. And on this event day, the price of electricity during a peak window is 10 times higher than what it would be on a normal day. So this is a clear price signal to the customers to reduce their usage during that time, so that some of that stress that the grid experiencing is mitigated. And peak time rebates is a mirror image of this rate. Instead of asking customers to pay more for electricity, you tell them, okay, on this event day, if you reduce your usage below a certain baseline, we're going to pay you. We're going to give you rebates for reducing your usage below a baseline level. But you essentially aim at the same thing, which is to mitigate peak problem. There's the variable pricing, where you have different day types and prices on those different day types, yellow, green, red. days change depending on the severity of energy prices and the peak constraints. Then there is real-time pricing, which is at the end of that variable rate spectrum, which customer rates are tied to LMPs either on a day-ahead basis or day-off basis. They essentially pay the costs that are incurred by the generators, and that's reflected to the customers. There's a two-part real-time pricing where the customer isn't as risk-taking. They basically say, for my baseline usage, I'm going to have static rates, but above a baseline, I'm willing to work with the market and follow real-time prices. And the last two in the list are not time varying, but they are important alternatives to be considered, three-part rates. And the third part here, the initial two parts are the same, a customer charge, a volumetric charge, but the third part here is a demand charge, which is really tying to some of these new grid-related investments that are happening due to electrification, due to new loads, that's signaling that demand and investment cost element through demand charges is going to be super important. And for those customers who are not interested in dealing with these time varying rates, there is this option called subscription pricing sometimes, or we call it fixed bills. But important element here is with incentives, because when you fix customers' bill or rates, you absolutely take away all the incentives for them to work with the grid price fluctuations. We don't want that, especially not now, where we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty and intermittency in managing the grid. The only way for this to be able to make sense in this environment is to say to customers, okay, you could pay a fixed bill, but you will need to sign up in these load flexibility programs. If you have a smart thermostat program, we should be able to control your smart thermostat. If you have an EV, we will sign up your EV in a managed charging program. So if you're willing to sign up on these programs, then you can have a fixed bill. So these are essentially all the viable alternatives out there. And, as I mentioned, we are making some progress, but there is definitely ways to go. One thing that I want to note here is retail rates are a very powerful tool. They're essential. Their fundamental premise is to recover the costs incurred by the utilities to be able to deliver and generate and transmit electricity. But beyond that, they are used to signal which technologies are more efficient, or they are used to push certain technologies versus others. And some of these things are really tricky to do and may need to inadvertent consequences that should be carefully thought through. But in the case of designing good retail rates, cost causation is something that we talk about a lot. And cost causation sometimes comes across as a backward-looking concept. But I want to highlight that it's also, if rate design is done well, it's also forward-looking, because if you are allocating generation, distribution, and transmission costs in the way that the customers are leading to these costs, then you're creating strong price signals. And to the extent that these strong price signals are there, for a small C&I customer or a large C&I customer, if they have a very strong demand charge, then they will take measures to mitigate or reduce that demand, so that in the future, you're not going to have to build as much capacity. So it's really important to follow this cost causation principle. And the time varying rates, in the way that they follow price signals in the wholesale market space, and then kind of rolled into the retail rates. And if customers respond to these price signals and move their load from high price to low price periods, then there are a lot of benefits for the system. We get to avoid future generation, transmission, and distribution capacity costs. We reduce energy costs because we are shifting from high price to low price periods. And we also help with the integration of renewable resources, because there are some flavors like APS has this TOU rate right now that the prices are really low in the middle of the day. And the idea is to soak up excess solar generation during the day. and the prices go higher up towards the end of the day. So there are all these ways that these rates could help really with providing that flexibility. And for those of you who are familiar with rate design principles, we talk a lot about bomb-right principles. These are things like cost causation. So rate should reflect the costs that are incurred to provide service. They should have customer orientation. They should advance equity. They should lead to revenue stability for the utilities, and they should lead to bill stability for the customers. So these 5 are the core principles. But more and more, we really get to have the discussions with our utility clients about load flexibility. Will this rate give me potential to have load flexibility in my system? So that's why I added as a new category here. And whenever a utility is pursuing these time varying pricing concepts, they really go through this exercise. They look at, okay, options are TOU rates, CPP, PTR, and RTP. Let me see how they do on cost causation. Let me see how they do on customer orientation. And these rankings, by the way, low, medium, high, they are a bit subjective, so don't get bogged down on the specific L, M, and H signs. What I want to focus is that there are a lot of trade-offs involved. You can't really choose one rate and expect to meet all objectives equally well. So given a jurisdiction's goals and policy objectives and customer base and experience with these kinds of rates will really determine which rate is really best for them to move forward from the current legacy structure. And these rates that we looked at, they are actually not very novel. They've been around for many, many decades. And in fact, several jurisdictions have deployed these rates in North America and the rest of the world, some of them on a default basis. They essentially said, no more two-part rates default for our residential customers. We're going to move everyone to time of use rates. And examples are California, SMUD, the utility in Colorado has done this. Ontario, Canada has had time of use rates as a default rate for almost 10 years now. And there are other jurisdictions who have not been ready to move to these rates on a default basis. So they've been offering rate choice to their customers. So in addition to a default rate, there would be several of these rates in the tariffs. And if a customer is really interested in saving in their monthly bills, and if they have flexibility, they would opt into some of these rates. And another consideration is that most of these time varying rates initially embraced by summer peaking utilities because they had the increasing summer peak problem with global warming. The summer peaks are increasing. So they essentially get excited about critical peak pricing and time of use rates because they were going to reduce their summer peaks. And there wasn't really much experience in the winter peaking utilities, but we see that that's really starting to change. Just in the mere 5 years, more utilities in the winter peaking systems have started to experiment with TOU rates and CPP rates. And in fact, some of these utilities are getting ready to deploy these rates on a default basis. And winter peaking systems, we expect to see more of them with increased emphasis on building electrification. And that's definitely going to be an important tool to mitigate the impacts on the winter peaking systems. And these are just a few examples on winter peaking systems. And they actually achieved very robust impacts as well. Hydro-Quebec and Nova Scotia Power, they tested CPP rates and with really strong peak to off-peak price ratios. In Hydro-Quebec's case, peak to off-peak price ratio was almost 8. And in Nova Scotia's case, it was almost 11, meaning that peak price on a critical event day was 11 times more than the off-peak price. And they achieved 20 to 27% reductions in peak. And again, most of these are opt-in, meaning that customers self-select into these rates. But imagine being able to do something like this on a default basis where we see, when you default customers to a rate, 80 to 90% of the customers stay on this rate. They don't opt out as much. Then all of a sudden you have a huge resource in your toolkit to be able to manage the peak and also some of the other needs that you may have in dealing with intermittency. Just in terms of where we are with these rates, I'm just curious by a count of hands, how many of you in this room have a time varying rate structure? Okay, a few, but really still a minority, right? So when we look at the most recent EIA Form 861 from 2022, we found that 380 utilities offered at least one form of time varying rates to residential customers. And overall, this represents 13 million customers or 9% of residential customers. So remember the statistic that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, 85% of the residential customers have AMI, but only 9% of these customers have access to a form of time varying rate. So there's a huge opportunity there waiting for us. On the commercial side, CNI side, 580 utilities offer at least one time varying rate to their commercial customers. Approximately 2 million customers are on these rates, and 12% is essentially 12% of commercial customers are represented or served by these rates. Again, there's also a big opportunity on the commercial side. I've already mentioned this, but the way you deploy these rates matter. You can either make it default. You tell customers, okay, this is the default rate. You can opt out of this rate if you don't really like it. And in that case, when you default all of the customers to a rate, we see that between 70 to 90% of the customers end up staying on this rate. But that's a more difficult thing to pull through politically because it's a big change. So many jurisdictions are leaning towards offering these rates on an opt-in basis. So there, the idea is, okay, there's this rate out there. If you think that you could manage this rate, if you have an amenable load profile, you could opt into this rate. And in those cases, in the best case scenarios, we see that up to 30% customers opt into this rate. And sometimes it takes many, many years to get to that 30% level. So there's not really a one-size-fits approach for deploying these rates. But if the goal is to achieve really important system-level impacts, the way to go is really to make some of these rates default. And this is just, we call this Manhattan skyline. It basically presents the evidence from 400 treatments of time varying rates over almost 80 pricing pilots. So on the x-axis, we have all these individual treatments, and on the y-axis, we have the peak reduction achieved in these pilots. So as you can see, there's a very robust response from the customers to these rates. So it's not a fluke. It's been tested and tried so many times to a point where whenever I get a call from a utility client, I basically start with, do you really need to pilot this rate? Because it's already been piloted so many times. Is there a way for this to be offered as part of the tariff? But there are, other reasons for why utilities want to pilot these rates on the operation side. They want to understand their billing systems can handle it and whatnot. The evidence is a lot more limited on the small CNI side. Small CNI group is a very tricky group. They are larger than residential customers, but they are not very large. They are usually small mom and pop shops and small restaurants. They're very heterogeneous. So it's very difficult to design a rate that would be attractive to this customer class. But despite that, there has been some pilots and implementations of time varying rates for the small CNI class. Another important thing to highlight is low-income customers. In the energy transition, affordability and equity and what happens to low-income customers is just a huge consideration. It comes up in every conversation, not as much as data centers, but trust me, it comes up a lot. So we have done several pilots that tested low-income customers side by side with the non-low-income customers to see if low-income customers respond at all. And if they respond, do they respond less, same, or more than non-low-income customers? We found that they definitely respond. In many cases, they respond as much as the non-low-income customers. So the idea that time varying rates will hurt low-income customers is definitely not supported by data. And it could in fact be a really good tool to help with the affordability as we go through the energy transition. Yeah, I've sat in a lot of focus groups, and low-income customers are usually the ones that are the most excited about these rates because they see the bill-saving opportunities. Just very quickly, so we've done this work a couple of years ago, so it's a bit outdated, but we compared the load flexibility potential coming from retail prices to smart thermostats. You know, smart thermostats are the most established way of controlling loads and load flexibility. And as you can see on the left-hand side, these rates, when they are especially deployed on a opt-out basis or default basis, that they have a pretty strong potential almost in comparison to the smart thermostats. So these are not additive. These are essentially showing that by 2025 and by 2030 in the US, how much peak reduction capacity that we can expect from each of these rates and other load flexibility measures if they're deployed using best practices. And we've also assigned some monetary value to that load reduction. And by 2030, assuming we're doing an opt-in TOU, which is the most likely based on the trends, that we are able to create 5 billion savings in terms of avoided energy, avoided capacity, and distribution costs. So my last slide here, what comes next? So we're very quickly nearing this important prices to devices breakthrough. Some of you may be following the developments in California. California CEC has rolled out this load flexibility standard and machine readable tariffs. So they're doing a lot of work to move things towards real-time pricing. And my personal opinion is that real-time pricing is going to stick when we figured out this prices to devices, because for a residential customer, it's inherently complex to deal with hourly prices. But you know, when we do have the prices to devices, it's going to be super valuable. But in the meantime, a solution could be a TOU rate where, you know, where we would enable daily load shifting from high price to low price hours or high net load to low net load hours. But on top of that, layer a critical peak pricing element so that on a select number of event days where, you know, grid is really constrained, that you also have a tool to manage that peak problem. You could also do that at the distribution level. You could call these event days based on certain parts of the distribution grid where you have a lot of EVs and running into, you know, substation transformer constraints. You could call these event days to manage the constraints. So, you know, something to think about. And several utilities and San Diego Gas Electric definitely has given a try to this concept. But you know, oftentimes regulators are really the ones that are basically just being a bit risk averse on some of these ideas. But hopefully that'll change in the coming years, given how many different problems we need to solve, and we'll see more progress in this area. With that, I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Sanem. And now we're going to go ahead. While I'm doing this, we'll get Obadiah mic'd up. But one of the interesting things that comes up if you take a look at the table when you get the slides, the issues with Hydro-Quebec, it's actually very interesting. Hydro-Quebec has actually gone out on record, and this sort of ties into the last session, that they're thinking about using their hydro system as a large battery for North America. And so one of the ways in which they can manage that is actually through the use of that critical peak pricing. And they've actually made mention of this. So it's one of those things, again, as we're looking towards zero emitting resources and how we're managing this. And if you think of the hydro system, a reservoir hydro system such as Hydro-Quebec's, looks like a really large battery. The same is also true for BC Hydro here in the West. And BC Hydro is now starting to play with that kind of concept where you can use retail rates as in conjunction with their hydro system as a battery for the rest of the interconnection. And so, you know, this all kind of dovetails together in meeting some of these objectives. But the one piece here is it's about choice. You know, if people have choice of the different rates, which many of us don't, then you can actually choose, you can actually have customers self-select for what they're most comfortable with. And so that's another form of choice that goes just beyond competition. So with that, Obadiah, I'm going to turn it over to you for, the example from SMUD and what you guys have found with some of this.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks to y'all for being here. I will step right in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our direct experiences with a few different of these rate structures that Sanem just reviewed, our time of day experience for residential customers, our experience with looking at critical peak pricing versus more of a programmatic incentivized demand response. Some work we're doing on dynamic price to device as it relates to EV managed charging. And then some of the things that we're thinking about as we're being pushed to look harder at dynamic rates and thinking about, what is the reality of doing price to device and actually billing on that? How do we think about customer protection and making sure that they can get into these rates with a clear value proposition and not be too exposed to some of the random events that we experience on the wholesale side? How we think about location-specific issues that are coming up with dynamic rate designs. And then a couple last topics there, thinking about rates as an operational signal versus rates as investment signals. And finally, some thinking we're doing around our commercial battery VPP and the underlying rate structures that customers there are looking at. So for our time of day rates, SMUD started looking at this issue back in the 2000s, and as part of our first ARA grant, proposed to put about 50,000 customers onto a pilot to test out default time of day rates. This was 2008, 2009. We proposed this, tested it over the next couple of years. It was pretty much roundly thought, universally thought across the utility that we would never default customers onto time of day rates. But after the results of the pilot, everyone basically took it as a given that we definitely should default customers onto time of day rates. It was an amazing success, and I'll show what that looks like. But first, some details on that. It's we implemented a 3-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio with a 3-hour peak window from 5 to 8 p.m., which really having that narrow window allowed for customers to respond without having so long of a duration that it just made customers get fatigued. So that was an important feature. We currently have 97% of the customers who've remained on the rate versus opting for a flat rate after being defaulted onto it. We saw about 130 megawatts of savings during our hot days, so about 4 or 5% of our SMUD overall peak and about 10% of residential demand. And our off-peak rates, so these are non-5 to 8 during non-summer, about 61% of the hours of the year, are pretty supportive of electrification. They come in pretty low at about 11.8 cents per kilowatt hour versus our on-peak rates of about 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So what that looks like, this is just showing some of the results comparing in the black line there, our 2023 kind of hot, medium hot day or planning 1 and 2 day there, and as well our 2022 September 6th date there, which was kind of an all-time record peak for us. And you can see that's kind of more aligned to a 1 in 10 type planning day for us. And then 2017, so that was pre-time of day in the red, and that's showing kind of that higher peak there. So what happened is the customers are reducing demand during that peak period and really pushing our peak a little bit earlier in the day to between the 4 and 5 p.m. hours, which was helpful for aligning to a bit more solar generation for us. So it's got kind of a compounding benefit there with that time window. A couple of things I'll mention about some of the challenges with this rate. We implemented this in 2017, 2018, and we are in 2024, and changes to these rate structures are still off the table as far as our political layer has determined. It's really difficult to change rates on customers, especially default rates like this. And they've really wanted to not touch those, which has been challenging as we're observing more and more over generation in the midday and really wanting to send those kinds of price signals to customers to consume during the midday versus the overnight time frame. So that's a particular challenge. Customers get very locked into these rate structures with their investments, which creates another challenge as we look to shift rates. It's shifting people's paybacks on things like solar and storage around quite a bit, which creates some pushback when we look at changing rates. One last challenge I'll mention is that, these are seasonal averages. And so, we have moderately hot days where the prices really don't suggest that we should be asking customers to change behavior, but these rates are the same day in, day out, whether it's a hot or a medium hot day. And so we get these savings occurring on days when we don't really need them. We're getting customers to shift behavior when we don't really need them to. So that's not a great outcome. So we started looking at this critical peak pricing approach to try to get closer to when do we really need the customer behavior. We piloted this from about 2012 to 2017, and we coupled it with giving away free thermostats that had an automated response to this signal. And we saw increased savings from these customers versus incentivized customers. We also saw that the customers had a very high customer satisfaction on the program and a relatively comparable uptake to the offer when it was the only offer given to them. So we decided to pilot this with our Bring Your Own Thermostat program in 2022, 2023. These are customers who've purchased a Nest or Ecobee thermostat, and we thought we would see kind of similar results there. We did see increased savings from these customers, but in order to get those, we actually had to put quite a bit of the capacity benefit into that rate structure in the discount side. So we had about a 50-cent adder on top of our time of use rate for those critical peak days or hours, and a discount during the rest of hours of about 2 cents. So that created about an 8-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio on the critical peak days. And so what we saw is we've been able to recruit about 20,000 customers onto the incentive program, but some of the complexities of that rate structure on the critical peak pricing program have led us to only being able to recruit about 700 customers onto that critical peak pricing rate. One complexity there is the OEM kind of element of this game, where the OEMs basically are not that excited about the idea of critical peak pricing. They'd really like to see customers recruited onto a no risk kind of rebate approach versus one where the customer is exposed to some risk. So we've actually had to recruit customers first on the incentive program and then subsequently re-recruit them onto the critical peak price rate, which was a big difference from our pilot evaluation that I mentioned earlier. We also ran into an issue of who we should recruit. We had some really serious structural winners. In one example, a customer who was stood to save about $1,300 a year just by switching onto the rate with no changes to behavior. It turned out that appeared to be a residential home that had been converted to a cannabis growing operation, so had a very flat base load. So any discount to all those hours, they saw some really significant benefits. But we also saw many structural losers on this rate. And trying to get a revenue neutral rate, we were aiming to recruit some customers who were structural winners and some customers who were structural losers, and try and have those balance out and see net benefit with the behavioral results. So that was also a difficult conversation about how do we actually recruit these customers onto a rate when our modeling shows they might lose money on that rate. This shows a quick picture of our forecast of what we thought customers would save in the red line. These are for the customers that ultimately took us up on this offer. And the actual savings that they saw in the yellowish orange line there. And a couple of things that were interesting to us about this, even though we tried to recruit customers who we thought might lose money on this rate, the customers that actually signed up were the ones that showed predicted savings. which was interesting to us and perhaps suggesting that we were getting the customers who were already doing what they could to reduce their peak demand, and so had a flatter rate structure, as it were. We also saw that this variability in savings was pretty tremendous. So some customers were behaving in ways that were helpful and saving more than was modeled, and some customers, a lot of customers, were behaving in ways that were less helpful, and so saw a lot less savings than predicted. Overall, a lot of uncertainty, though, about what to tell customers that they could expect to save relative to what we predicted. On average, we saw about $24 in savings per customer, and oddly, a majority of those savings were appeared to be structural savings rather than behavioral savings, even though we were automating their thermostat response. So we're still continuing this pilot, trying to learn what we can and see if we can do a better job of recruitment and get to better outcomes from this. But at the moment, this appears to be more expensive than our simpler incentive-based program in terms of getting a KW demand response from these customers. Shifting gears a little bit to dynamic pricing, we're currently using a dynamic pricing signal to try to influence EV charging for residential customers. And I'll just explain on this chart what's going on. We've randomly grouped customers into one of four groups that we've slightly offset their kind of optimal low-priced charging period. And those are the hours during midnight to 6 a.m. there. You can see that are slightly offset from one another by group. And then we've put an adder into our peak pricing window to try and reinforce avoiding charging during those times. We're sending those prices to the OEMs and to a third party to respond to those prices and do their best to make sure the customer gets a full charge when they've asked for it. So say by 7 a.m. at their leave by time, and then do as best a job as they can at maximizing charging during their group's respective low price period. Our preliminary evaluation shows pretty significant variation in price responsiveness across the OEMs and with our third party, and a fairly lengthy learning process, a lot of iteration with these folks to learn how to respond to these price signals effectively while meeting the customer's needs. That's been challenging for us to think about, what is dynamic pricing going to look like as we get into maybe sending these signals to more and different kinds of parties and parties that are more at a contractual arm's length than us. How do we structure those contracts to make sure that they're getting the learnings? How do we give them the right information to improve response to the prices? One of the things we've seen is that vehicles are typically plugged in only once out of 3 or 4 days. So that really impacts our flexibility. We've been messaging and trying to get customers to plug in more so that we can have more ability to shift their charging around. We also have added in and put in subtractors into the wholesale pricing to really differentiate the prices a bit more, and done that staggered grouping that I mentioned to try to avoid a situation where we're sending a single price signal and customers are kind of overwhelming a local transformer by having coordinated response to those low price periods. So some of the things we're thinking about of where do we go from here for dynamic rates? This question of can we actually charge these EV customers for their charging based on a dynamic rate, so dynamic price to device. We've seen that metering costs can be a barrier to tackling this, so putting in dedicated sub-meters. We also have a diverse set of EVSEs out there. Many of them are non-communicating, so thinking about changing those out is a barrier. Telematics across OEMs are not standardized. So if we want to use telematics for this, it's a bit challenging to account for differences in EVSEs or cable losses and different measurement approaches by OEM. We need validation there. We are hopeful that this new generation of AMI meters we're rolling out will be able to disaggregate EV loads really accurately. These are taking hundreds of samples per second of loads and promise to be able to disaggregate quite accurately, but are pretty costly to deploy. We're able to do it through a grant that we won through GRIP, but it's definitely a challenge thinking about it without those grant funds. Another aspect that we're concerned about is protecting customers from extended high prices. We've had a couple recent examples over the last 5 years. One of about 3 weeks of sustained high prices due to a transmission outage from wildfires during the summer, and another about 5 weeks in the winter of really sustained high prices that were a couple different factors: unexpected cold snap, a gas storage facility being out, gas transmission outage, and low working storage, all bringing together for sustained prices of over $300 a megawatt hour for about 5 weeks. So how do we protect customers who are seeing LMPs at that level and keep them on a dynamic price program like this, knowing that they'll exit if they see those kinds of prices for too long? And then location-specific issues. Our main concern there is equity issues. You know, customers could adopt enough EVs on a transformer that non-participating customers could see significant exposure. So how do we make sure that only the customers that want to see that exposure are getting it? And what do we do if they decide they've had enough of it? It's difficult to address distribution system constraints without a location-specific signal. But as we think about where those constraints occur, we've got tens of thousands of constrained transformers that would be challenging to create, you know, individual pricing for and track that in our systems and do the billing accurately with differentiated pricing. So that gets pretty complicated in addition to the equity issues that I raised. A couple last topics: rates as an investment signal versus operational signal. So frequently, customers and third parties are looking at our rates and assuming that's kind of like a long-term contract and that they're going to get this guaranteed payback against these forever kind of similar rate structure that's just going to be escalating in a similar structure. It makes it difficult to make frequent rate changes, and the more complex we make the rate structures, that can really undermine customer willingness to invest. Creates a lot more uncertainty around their payback. So that's a constant trade-off we're trying to manage. As we shift into time of use and dynamic rates, that looks more like an operational signal. So that's helpful, but can undermine it, especially as we get more dynamic customers' willingness to invest in things like battery storage or solar PV. But we know at the same time as we're evolving this energy system, these rate structures are going to have to evolve with it. And so it's really a conundrum of figuring out how to get customer investments to occur and also to shift those investments over time, shift those operational signals. Let's see. The last slide I was going to present is on our commercial VPP structure. We're looking to deploy a program where we have 100% utility control of behind-the-meter commercial storage. How do we structure incentive and operational agreement that we can provide customer certainty that they'll get a return on their investment? Our dispatch, you know, we can model out what we think our dispatch of that storage is going to look like over 10 years, but when we get into the operational window, it's very likely that that dispatch is going to change. We may not dispatch devices as much, or we may dispatch them slightly misaligned with their underlying rate structures that could undermine their investment. So that's causing a lot of thought about how we should compensate these customers in light of their underlying rate structure, and whether we need something like a guaranteed payment for capacity if the arbitrage and demand savings don't overcome a certain threshold. So those are just some of our thoughts about the challenges in this space. I think we're definitely excited to continue to evolve rate structures and try and get better alignment with our underlying cost structures. But we've got these different layers of political complexity and customer complexity that we're having to deal with to try and see how far we can push and what are the kinds of outcomes we can expect from these emerging rate structures. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Obadiah. All right. And now to quote the immortal John Cleese for something completely different. What we're going to do now is we're going to kind of change up gears and turn it over to Carl Linvill. And Carl is going to get into thinking about rate designs that, you know, looking at a carbon-free electricity tariff. So now we've kind of gone from operations, you know, and we can see some of the problems. If you don't get the prices right between wholesale and retail, as Obadiah is talking about, it creates problems. We're looking at peak demand savings, but now we're actually going to talk about tariffs that actually have the ability to, as I try to share this again, that have the ability to really get us into a carbon-free world. So Carl, I turn it over to you, sir.
Okay.
And thank you for showing up today.
Oh, you're most welcome. So I'm going to actually start by sitting, and then I'm going to come up and go through the slide deck. Oh, can you do full screen? Yeah. There you go. Well, while we're getting that, I'll go ahead and start. So I got a really good set of comments on the presentation I'm giving you today. And I decided I really needed to frame how I'm thinking about this. So I ended up writing an introductory kind of speech. And I don't usually read speeches, but I was nervous that I wouldn't be able to do this off the fly. So I'm going to talk to you about rate making and rate design for an optional 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariff. And here's the punchline for why I think this is an important issue. Default retail rates fail to set retail rates that reflect the price of carbon, and thus fail to induce the customer and utility investments and behavior that match federal, state, or corporate decarbonization goals. Since there's no prospect that a proper carbon price will be assessed locally by states or by the federal government, tweaking rate design can help align the prices faced by customers with grid needs, but these tweaks will really prove inadequate if we expect them to support existing state, local, and corporate decarbonization goals. So the conversations about rate design are helpful and important, but they really aren't adequate to getting at the levels of decarbonization that many are aspiring for. I'll just give you one quick example. And the background of what I'm going to talk to you about today is my context of the Western United States, which is mostly vertically integrated utilities. Working a lot with the state of Oregon right now. It has an 80% decarbonization goal by 2030, believe it or not, which is aggressive to say the least. And how are we going? Is the pricing that we're deploying, are the programs that we're deploying going to approach their need to get to that level? The answer really is no. So that's a starting point for this. Generally, I see some challenges that rate making and rate design have really aren't helping enough with right now. For example, we aren't inducing carbon-free firming resources like long duration storage and enhanced geothermal fast enough. We aren't inducing distribution system investments that spawn carbon-free virtual power plants fast enough. We aren't inducing grid-enhancing technologies that expand transmission capacity to access complementary carbon-free resources fast enough. We aren't inducing new transmission to access complementary carbon-free resources fast enough. We aren't inducing a carbon-free firming resource reserve so that we don't have to pull out the diesel generators and the high heat rate gas resources when reliability gets tight. And we're having a hard time keeping volumetric rates low as electrification accelerates. These are some problems that we can help with a little bit through rate design, but really it requires an integration of rate design, rate making, and resource planning to really get at these problems. I'm sure you could come up with some others that I haven't included in my list. If we had a proper carbon price on a national basis, a lot of these would be addressed with price signals that would be reflected through retail rates, and we'd be making more progress. But that's not on the horizon. In some places, we have a carbon price, like California, but it's about $37. And a $37 carbon price is not commensurate with the pace of change that we're trying to accommodate. In other places, we have decarbonization goals, where the price is implicitly imposed by policy goals enforced by regulators or governing boards. But in neither of these places that are trying to accelerate decarbonization, do we really have a proper carbon price. We have implemented green power tariffs. We have introduced policies like renewable portfolio standards that have driven important investments in resources and infrastructure. But these green tariffs and policies do not differentiate the value of carbon-free electricity by time of production or place of production, so there is no price signal directing investments to underutilized resources. And then what happens when we impose aggressive decarbonization policy? We get an implicit that ends up being paid utility ratepayers, which drives up rates and impedes electrification progress, which stunts decarbonization and puts decarbonization policies at risk of ratepayer revolt. Furthermore, we don't base our investment or consumption choices on temporal and locational value, although we've seen there's some exceptions, but generally we don't. And our choices are now doomed to be economically inefficient. So if we want to honor state and local decarbonization goals, and we want to keep general ratepayer impact low, what can we do? We can mobilize private capital. We can mobilize public capital, local, state, and federal. We can better align utility investment with private and public investment to avoid redundancy and promote capital formation of important carbon-free resources that aren't being developed and infrastructure that aren't being developed fast enough today. What I'm going to suggest is introducing optional tariffs for those with more aggressive decarbonization goals who are willing to pay is an approach. And we can bring these things together. One way of doing this is my topic today, which is rate making and rate design considerations for an optional 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariff. So that's the motivation. Let's see how much of my time. I used 8 minutes. There's a lot of content in this, so I'm not going to go through everything. But I led an effort over the last almost 18 months now to develop a report on 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariffs. We brought together stakeholders, about 60 stakeholders, utilities, technology companies, large commercial customers, federal government, local governments, folks who are focused on getting carbon accounting and reporting and tracking done right. And we sought their advice for how can we accelerate the availability and adoption of optional 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariffs for those who wish to pursue them. We do have a, let's see, I just hit the down key. There we go, that worked. If you want to see the report, here you go. And this presentation will be posted. This is an excerpt from a webinar I did about a month ago with some of my colleagues at RAP. And so you can check that out on our website as well. Many people don't know that the United Nations has a 24/7 global compact, which is a commitment to 24/7 carbon-free electricity. 148 entities have joined, and many of them are corporate entities. Some are national governments, and some are local governments. It includes the US federal government. How many people knew that the US federal government signed on to a 24/7 global compact? Nobody did. Okay. That happened last December. And if you talk to Jigar Shah or others in the federal government, you'll find that they're busy looking for opportunities to implement 24/7 tariffs with utilities around the country. You may have heard of a project with Entergy. The federal government entered into a 24/7 contract with Entergy, and there are additional ones in the works. So how does 24/7 differ from an annual matching tariff? Like I said, green power tariffs have been great. They've been important in generating investment in large-scale renewables. But when many of our problems that we talked about, as we've talked about with rate design, are really temporal and locational in nature due to variable energy resources, annual matching just doesn't do the trick. We need to go to more granular matching. Why are customers and utilities interested? First of all, I just want to say that the customers that are interested include some CCAs in California, some of which have implemented 24/7 tariffs, include some cities and counties that are looking at implementing 24/7. Also includes the federal government, includes some large commercial customers. And these customers are attracted for one or more of these reasons. I'm going to go pretty fast because I don't have a whole lot of time. Utilities are also interested. Utilities in places, especially where large customers or the federal government are important customers, are interested in working with their customers to keep them happy and to try to help them to meet their goals. They're also interested in attracting new customers like those with data centers. It helps in states that have aggressive decarbonization goals to have this booster of having private investment brought in to help to accelerate decarbonization. So our report lays out 5 fundamentals to drive an effective tariff and equitable rate design for this optional 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariff. First of all, to integrate transition tariff investments with ongoing utility planning. So we usually talk about rate design as happening within a context where planning is happening in parallel, right? We usually don't think about bringing rate design and rate making together with planning in the same process. When we do that, when we offer optional tariffs using that approach, we don't integrate the tariffs, the investments having to do with the optional tariffs with the ongoing investments, the utility. For these particular programs, integrating those private investments with the utility investment plan is really important. We have to ensure accurate hourly emissions tracking and verification. We want to design tariffs to accelerate complementary investments. So we'd like this to encourage private entities to make investments that we would rather spare the ratepayer from having to pay for, but where hopefully we can bring in benefits to the ratepayers and thereby clarify where the utilities' complementary investments are best made. We want to employ rate design to ensure fairness and to align carbon-free electricity grid needs with pricing and compensation. And finally, we want to integrate operating systems to implement hourly matching. So how does a 24/7 transition tariff drive incremental emissions reductions? So basically what we argue in this paper is that the virtual cycle of establishing these 5 fundamentals and pursuing them together drives incremental investments that otherwise wouldn't be made, clarifies complementary investments, and thereby decreases emissions. So another important feature of rate making, planning, and rate design that don't often get brought together are that rate making and rate design happen in the context of public policies. Of course, the standard public policy of providing safe, reliable, and resilient service. Some places have a policy around societal equity. Administrative feasibility is an important goal. Promoting innovation and competition in the industry and to achieve societal goals is important. And achieving public health and environmental goals. So to the extent that these 24/7 tariffs support these other goals, then those benefits should be calculated at the same time as we calculate the costs. The rate making goals are familiar and they're in line with what you've heard about already. We want to be effective in yielding total revenue requirements for the utility. We want to ensure that the customer understands and accepts the deal. We want to provide for an equitable allocation of costs and the avoidance of undue discrimination. And we want to provide efficient price signals that encourage optimal or at least positive customer behavior. So with respect to establishing a 24/7 tariff, what are the rate making points that we need to emphasize in order to achieve that? We have to establish the rate structure. We have to identify the eligible load and the resources that are qualified to serve that load that comply with the tariff terms. We need to establish the incremental costs that are caused by the 24/7 program. We need to establish the incremental benefits of the 24/7 program. And we need to establish a duration of the tariff arrangement because we're talking about making longer term investments here. And so commitment to the tariff over some period of time, say 10 years or so, is important. So the recommendations that we come out with in our report to support the 24/7 transition tariff are: 1, determine the net costs using integrated planning. So bringing the rate making and rate design discussion into the integrated planning discussion. Secondly, to allocate net costs of carbon-free electricity to participating customers. So those who sign up for the optional tariff should be paying any net costs. Third, design incentives to manage the demand side, because an important resource that needs to be brought into play is shaping the load and managing the demand to help produce that carbon-free portfolio. And then finally, plan to co-optimize customer and utility investments. So thank you very much. That's what I've got for you.